What I really need is to be clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except in the way knowledge must precede all action. Certainly, I won't deny that I still accept an imperative of knowledge, and that one can also be influenced by it, but then it must be taken up alive in me. It is this my soul thirsts for, as the African deserts thirst for water.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sound and Sophia. Today we're in Gilleleje, a place where Søren Kierkegaard spent a couple of summers. So today's episode is on Søren Kierkegaard's ethical sphere. It is very much in contrast with the aesthetical sphere, which we discussed in the last episode. So I would recommend you to watch that episode before you watch this one. As we discussed in the last episode, a person living in the aesthetic sphere will sooner or later find himself in a state of despair. The casual sex, drugs and alcohol just won't fill the void anymore. At this point, the person will have to make a choice. Either he will stay in the aesthetic sphere and try to numb the despair with even more sex, drugs and alcohol, or he will move on to the next stage, which is the ethical stage.
The ethical is in many ways the opposite of the aesthetic, but some values from the aesthetic sphere remains in the ethical. The way I look at it is that the aesthetic more or less collapses down into the ethical. It enriches more than it takes away.
For instance, in the aesthetic sphere, a person is solely living and relating to the immediate moment. But in the ethical sphere, the immediate moment still remains, but now he also relates to the past and the future.
The ethical person utilizes the past. He will reflect upon his bad qualities and mistakes he's made in order to make himself a more ethical and better person in the future. So the usage of the past is usually done in an order to create a better future for oneself. With the expansions of these time categories, past and the future, comes also anxiety. If one only relates to the instantaneous moment, one does not experience anxiety. But with the discovery of the future in the ethical sphere, along comes anxiety. So with the ethical, new problems appear.
In the second part of Either Or, we get to meet Wilhelm, and he's writing letters addressed to Johannes the Seducer, and he is more or less trying to convince Johannes to evolve into the ethical sphere.
Quote, "And therefore comes despair in the next moment, not as a halt, but as a metamorphosis. Everything will come back, but now explained. It's when you see life ethically that your life becomes beautiful, true, meaningful, and persistent." So here it is clear that the aesthetic collapses down into the ethical. Wilhelm is even saying later in the book that what Johannes enjoys in the aesthetic will remain, and it will even intensify in strength if he moves on to the ethical sphere.
So aesthetic pleasure very much exists in the ethical sphere as well. But here, the ethical person is in control of his lusts.
Here Wilhelm writes, "Think of a man who's descended into gambling. The lust wakes up with all its passion. It is as though his life would end if this need was not satisfied. Is he at this moment capable to tell himself, "In this moment I don't want to, but in an hour I might"? Then he is cured. This hour is the continuity that cures him.
In the aesthetic sphere, the ego was the most important thing, but in the ethical sphere, as the name implies, you will begin to think ethically about other people. From what I've read, Kierkegaard doesn't imply a specific kind of ethical system. The essential part is that you start thinking about other people more than just yourself. You're including other people in your telos.
So the future and other people becomes important in the ethical sphere. So one will begin to work hard in life and sacrifice the present immediate kicks for the future. It is like the Marshmallow Test. If you haven't heard about it before, it was a study on delayed gratification in 1972 led by the psychologist Walter Mischel. They would give children a couple of treats and say, "If you don't eat any of these sugary treats for 15 minutes, I will give you more." The aesthetic person would eat the first treats for sure. Remember, the aesthetic is all about pleasure in the immediate moment. The future does not exist. And the ethical person would wait out the 15 minutes. Sacrificing the present for the future in this manner is really the opposite we discussed in the last episode with drinking alcohol, which results in the sacrificing of the future for the present pleasure. So delayed gratification is certainly a trait of the ethical person.
One important factor for Kierkegaard in the ethical sphere is marriage. Because if you think about it, marriage should really be the dissolvement of the ego into something bigger, like family. Marriage itself is not a gateway to the ethical sphere. One can still marry and be in the aesthetic sphere. Let me explain.
For example, if you would say things like, "If I marry this person, I will be complete," or "I want children, so I better get married first," the I should turn into a first person plural, a we. We will be complete, a family. And it has to be a conscious decision made by the individual. This is also why marriage before having children is so important. Having kids while living in the aesthetic sphere can have devastating impact on the children. It's really not weird that the church and society look down on sex before marriage, before the existence of birth controls.
So marriage can be seen through an aesthetic lens as well, when one only does it for egoistic reasons.
One thing that I myself really like about this way of thinking is that it's a way of categorizing different things. For instance, in the book Stages on Life's Way, we once again meet Judge Wilhelm, where he is talking about falling in love in contrast with marriage. Falling in love can typically be seen through an aesthetic lens because of its involuntary nature. It's not like you're walking past a girl and think, "She seems like a nice lady. I'm choosing to fall in love with her."
Well, falling in love doesn't really work like that. Falling in love is definitely in the aesthetic category. It is a deterministic thing. You don't choose to fall in love. But marriage, on the other hand, is an ethical choice. You need to be a self-reflecting individual in order to make the decision to marry, the decision to spend the rest of your life with another human being. So, have you figured out which sphere you're occupying? Well, I think the easiest way to answer that question is to ask, what is your telos? Is your telos, or your end goal, so to say, to maximize your own pleasure? Or is it to live ethically and help other people? So before you answer that question, we actually have one sphere left, the religious sphere, which we will be discussing in the next episode.
Also, I want to add, if one has evolved from the aesthetic to the ethic, there is nothing that hinders falling back to the aesthetic sphere, since the ethical comes with a great deal of responsibility. A position of the self is never fixed. There is always a possibility for the self to move.
As always, thank you so much for watching. You know the deal by now. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and you can also support me on Patreon if you'd like. I hope you all have a really good one. Take care.